Do you ever stop to wonder, is the media truly serving us, the public, or are there hidden strings being pulled behind those headlines? This question is at the heart of the seminal book, Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of the Mass Media, penned by EdwardSHerman and Noam Chomsky. This compelling study first hit the shelves in 1988, and it's been sparking debate and introspection ever since. The title, Manufacturing Consent, is a phrase that encapsulates the book's central thesis. It suggests that our media, despite its facade of freedom and independence, often operates as a system that molds and dictates public discourse. And more often than not, it aligns with the interests of the political and economic elites. Herman and Chomsky argue that the media, rather than presenting an impartial and unbiased view of the world, frequently serves the interests of the powerful. How? By framing issues in a manner that buttresses established power structures. The authors present a media analysis model based on the propaganda model. They identify 5 filters through which news content must pass before it reaches us: the public, ownership of the media, advertising, sourcing, flack, and anti-communism, or other ideologies that serve the interests of the elites. The authors posit that these filters work in unison to shape the narrative and restrict the range of acceptable discourse. They bolster their argument by critically examining media coverage of historical events, such as the Vietnam War and the US's involvement in Central America. While the book has been hailed for its critical analysis, it's also faced criticism from those who believe it oversimplifies the intricate dynamics of media influence. But whether you agree with its conclusions or not, Manufacturing Consent remains a significant work in the fields of media studies and political communication. So, are we being informed or are we being manipulated? It's time to delve deeper into the world of media. Let's peel back the layers and examine the machinery that drives our news, our information, and ultimately, our understanding of the world around us. What if there's a hidden mechanism that decides what makes the news and what gets left out? This might sound like a plotline from a dystopian novel, but according to EdwardSHerman and Noam Chomsky, authors of Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of the Mass Media, it's a reality. They introduce us to what they call the propaganda model, a framework that explains how news content is filtered before it reaches us, the public. The first filter is the ownership of the media. Who owns the outlet? A handful of corporations dominate the media landscape. Their interests, biases, and agendas inevitably influence the news we consume. Next, we have advertising, the lifeblood of many media outlets. Advertisers pay for the platform, and naturally they want content that aligns with their brand. This leads to a subtle yet powerful bias in favor of news that's advertiser-friendly. The third filter is sourcing. News outlets rely on a steady stream of information. They often turn to government, corporate, and other powerful sources to maintain this flow. Depending on these sources, however, can slant the news towards their viewpoints. The fourth filter is flack, a term used to describe negative responses to a media statement or program. It could be in the form of lawsuits, complaints, or general bad PR. Media outlets wanting to avoid this may steer clear of controversial stories. Finally, there's anti-communism, or, broadly speaking, the dominant ideology. News that contradicts the prevailing ideology often gets marginalized or ignored. So what does this all mean? The propaganda model suggests that our news doesn't just happen. It passes through filters that can distort, frame, and ultimately influence what we see, hear, and believe. It's a sobering perspective, reminding us to question the information we consume. This model suggests that our free and independent media might not be as free and independent as we think. Let's look at history, where the pen might have been mightier, but was it also craftier? Let's delve into the depths of the past, where the mass media has played a significant role in shaping public opinion, often serving the interests of the powerful. Manufacturing Consent provides a critical examination of media coverage of historical events, and the authors use these examples to illustrate their argument. 2 key events that they focus on are the Vietnam War and the US involvement in Central America. Firstly, let's examine the Vietnam War. The authors argue that the media's portrayal of the war was not an objective recounting of events, but rather a narrative that served the interests of the US government. The media was not a neutral observer, but an active participant in the war effort, helping to shape public opinion in support of the war. The authors argue that the media's coverage of the war was filtered through the lens of US interests, which resulted in a skewed portrayal of the conflict. The US involvement in Central America serves as another example. The authors suggest that the media's coverage of the U.S. interventions in countries like Nicaragua and El Salvador was heavily influenced by the U.S. government's narrative. The media played a key role in promoting the government's foreign policy objectives, framing these interventions as necessary actions to combat communism and protect U.S. interests. These examples illustrate how the media, despite being ostensibly free and independent, often function as a system that shapes and controls public discourse. This is not to say that the media is a monolithic entity that uniformly adheres to the interests of the powerful. There are always exceptions, and there are always journalists and media outlets that strive to provide an objective and unbiased view of the world. But the authors argue that these are the exceptions rather than the rule. The examples of the Vietnam War and the U.S. interventions in Central America highlight the author's argument about the media's role in serving the interests of powerful institutions. They show how the mass media, through its coverage of these historical events, helped to shape public opinion in a way that supported the established power structures. This is not a critique of journalism or journalists per se, but rather a critique of the systemic factors that influence the media and shape its output. The authors argue that these systemic factors, the 5 filters of the propaganda model, work together to constrain the range of acceptable discourse and shape the narrative in a way that aligns with the interests of the powerful. These historical events shed light on a media system that may be more about maintaining power than about informing the public. In the end, the authors suggest that the media's primary role is not to inform the public, but to manufacture consent for the policies and actions of the powerful. This is a provocative and challenging argument, but it is one that deserves our attention and consideration. Like any groundbreaking work, Manufacturing Consent has its supporters and its critics. The book has been lauded for its profound insight into the machinations of the media and its role in serving the interests of the powerful. It has been hailed as a pioneering exploration into the media's ability to shape public opinion, even in societies that pride themselves on free speech and democratic values. However, it has also faced criticism. Some argue that Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model oversimplifies the complex dynamics of media influence. They contend that the model doesn't fully account for the diversity of voices and viewpoints present in the media landscape, nor does it adequately consider the role of journalists' individual biases and perspectives. Critics also point out that the model doesn't neatly apply to all media systems across different countries and cultures. Despite these criticisms, it's impossible to deny the book's influence. Manufacturing Consent has been a game-changer in the fields of media studies and political communication. It has prompted scholars and readers alike to question the role of the media in shaping our understanding of the world. It has sparked debates about media ownership, the influence of advertising, sourcing practices, and the role of ideology in news production. The book's influence extends beyond academia. It has inspired a generation of journalists, activists, and citizens to question the narratives presented by the media, to dig deeper, and to seek out alternative sources of information. In the age of social media, where information and misinformation can spread like wildfire, the questions raised by Manufacturing Consent are more relevant than ever. Who controls the media narrative? Whose interest does it serve? How does it shape our perception of the world? Manufacturing Consent has sparked a crucial conversation about the media's role in society, a conversation that is more relevant today than ever. So, who really controls the media narrative? As we delve into the final throes of Manufacturing Consent, we find ourselves circling back to this crucial question. The authors, Herman and Chomsky, argue that the media, rather than being an objective observer, often play the role of a puppet master, subtly shaping public opinion to align with the interests of powerful elites. The media narrative, they claim, is filtered through a propaganda model, manipulated by 5 key factors: the ownership of media, advertising, sourcing, flack, and ideologies that serve the elites. These filters work in tandem to limit the scope of acceptable discourse, effectively creating a controlled narrative that supports established power structures. Whether it's reporting on historical events or current affairs, this narrative serves to perpetuate the status quo, reinforcing the power dynamics at play. In this era of information overload, it's more essential than ever to question who is manufacturing our consent.